Welcome back. We need to know what are the building blocks that we can use to create apps, specifically Android ones. In this lecture, I'm gonna give you an overview of the most important elements. This is gonna be quite fast, but you don't need to memorize anything. You have a cheat sheet attached. The idea is that any cake recipe needs flour, eggs, butter, and so on, right? Most of them need the same things. So it's the same with apps. Let's take it from the top with the status bar. This is the tiny band at the top of any app that shows you the time, battery level, your carrier, and other notifications. It can be black, transparent, or it can be a solid color. This is the status bar, status bar, whatever, you get the idea. In terms of its design, we'll probably make it a solid color because that looks best. Immediately underneath the status bar comes the app bar. That's the official name, but it was also called the action bar a while back. Some developers still call it by that name, and I'm in that boat too. I think it best describes that area. Now, the action bar is quite important because it serves multiple functions, and we're gonna talk about it in a dedicated lecture. For now, let's learn to recognize it. You might see it occupy a single imaginary line like so, but it can also take up much more space, usually to make room for tabs. In rare cases, it may be transparent, but even then, there's always a mandatory element present, and that's this arrow, which is the universal Android sign to go back. It's actually called the up arrow in the official documentation, but again, we usually say it's the back arrow. Now, since I already mentioned it, let's focus on the next building block, tabs. Now, these can be used to split up your content. Android users are very familiar with the swipe gesture that switches tabs, as these are just about everywhere in just about every single app. Now, there are two types of tabs, fixed and scrollable. I prefer the first one because it's more aesthetically pleasing, since we divide the width of the artboard to the number of tabs. We can go with as little as 2 or as many as 4. 5 tabs becomes too crowded. In case you need more tabs, it's best that you use the scroll feature. The distance from the left edge is also quite significant, it's quite big. But overall, that's tabs in a nutshell. Okay, another component is the left menu, but not because it allows us to jazz it up. In terms of the design side, there's not a lot that we can do. Actually, this is really useful because it declutters the app. It makes it simpler, and Android users are highly used to this menu, and this allows us to hide quite a lot of content inside it. So instead of littering the action bar with loads and loads of icons or many tabs, you just move all of that right here. This layout is very much standard, so developers can quickly create the default look, which is what you see right here. We can customize the icons and add a bit of color, but that's about it in terms of customizing it. Again, developers always play a big role in this conversation, because if you create a slightly different layout, they're gonna have to do a lot of work on their end, which is quite difficult and again more expensive. Now, it's usually not worth the effort, so we're gonna keep it like this. So for that reason, the navigation panel won't get a separate lecture, at least not for now. Moving on, cards are a great way of presenting content. You can identify them by the white, slightly rounded base, which usually sits on top of a light gray background. It's fairly easy to confuse cards with lists. These are best used to show content that's similar in nature. For example, a recipe index, right? Cards, on the other hand, can display various types of content, like text, photos, and they're usually different. A dashboard is a good example of cards being used properly. Every item point is a different part of the app. Okay, now let's keep this going. My next component is present in just about every screen, and that's the pop-up screen. This is officially called a dialog, and it can be seen in two formats. The regular one, which is very easy to spot, and then the full screen one. We're gonna discuss both of these in a separate lecture, but you can quickly identify a full screen dialog by looking at the action bar. If you see this close icon coupled with an action word on the right side, then it's a dialogue. Okay, we're near the end, but I love these guys, so I really want to give them a shout out. Snack bars and toasts. Now, while these seem to be part of a balanced breakfast, these guys are actually used to inform the user of various things that just happened. Now, conceptually, these can be confused with dialogues, but we'll go through the differences soon enough. For now, let's make sure that we can spot them if we see them in a design. Unfortunately, we can't do a lot in terms of design work, but yeah, you have to know about them. They do really improve the user's experience. Next on our list are buttons. These are divided in two large categories: regular buttons and floating action buttons, which are also called FABs. Now, regular buttons are predictable. They're large, bright, they have a pressed state, and they can be placed just about everywhere in the screen, in a reasonable amount, of course. Now, floating action buttons are usually positioned in the bottom right side, and they're fixed. So as you scroll, the button stays put because that action is usually the main feature of the app. Now, for example, in WhatsApp, the FAB opens a new conversation. In Notes, the FAB creates a new entry. So that's the main difference between these two categories, classic buttons and FABs, but we're gonna talk about them in more depth in a separate lecture. Finally, let's talk about text fields in Android. So these are extremely versatile, and you can see them in just about any app out there. They might have a label or some text underneath them. They might have a drop-down arrow or a calendar icon next to them. The label will sometimes be displayed in line, and when you activate the field, it will move above it and shrink. These are a lot of fun, and they can dramatically change the way your app looks like. We're gonna use them quite a lot. But with that, we've concluded this overview about the major Android components. Now, I know that's a lot to take in, but please check out the attached cheat sheet, and you can even print it out. You don't have to memorize anything, as we're gonna discuss all the details in depth at the right time. Now, before you go, you should know that there are other Android components like chips, sliders, tooltips, and whatnot. But in my book, those aren't as important, and I really want to take it step by step. For that reason, we're not going to talk about them. Instead, we're going to focus on what we discussed here, because those are going to be in 90% of our projects. Okay, I'll see you in the next lecture.